Lecture 57, Samuel Johnson.
Essayist, literary critic, poet, philosopher, and lexicographer, Samuel Johnson embodies the spirit of the Enlightenment that produced such polymaths as Diderot in France and Goethe in Germany. The range of Johnson's reading and his capacity to recall what he had read was enormous. He was familiar with all the best literature, both classical and contemporary, and was most influenced in his own work by Shakespeare, Donne, Dryden, and Pope. Regardless of whether he was writing a biography of a famous author, or judging a contemporary or canonical poet, or assessing the worth of a classical imitation, or commenting on the moral dilemmas of his age, his writing always bears the signs of his learning and reading. His meditations and his social engagements, not ponderously and pompously expressed, but with a discerning style that always acknowledges the presence of the reader. Samuel Johnson was such a dominant literary figure in the second half of the 18th century that the period has traditionally been called the Age of Johnson. Johnson began his career as a freelance journalist, writing anonymous essays, poems, short biographies, and reviews, primarily for the weekly publication, The Gentleman's Magazine. It was only with the publication of his 2-volume dictionary in 1755 that Johnson acquired his lasting reputation as a man of letters. In this lecture, we will first explore Johnson's poetry, specifically The Vanity of Human Wishes, an imitation of a satire by the Latin poet Juvenal, and an exploration of the necessity for faith in a world of unsatisfied desire. We will then examine some of his essays from the Rambler, published between 1750 and 1752, into which Johnson poured the accumulated wisdom of years of reading and writing. And finally, we will turn to his Life of Pope, one of the several prefaces he wrote for an anthology of English poets, commonly referred to as the Lives of the Poets. This text, The Lives of the Poets, is exemplary of the critical role Johnson played in the construction of literary taste in the second half of the 18th century. It is also considered to be one of the volumes that created the discipline we now call literary criticism. In his own age, and for those critics and poets who followed him, it was Johnson's power of observation, especially of human behavior and the nobility and indignities of that condition, that marked his greatness. Those astute insights into human nature and the artistic productions that elevated the spirit were articulated in a prose that was both elegantly simple and yet capable of expressing the most complex ideas. Johnson's contribution to the history of literature lies not only in his work as a maker of dictionaries and in his critical assessment of the poetry of his own and previous generations, but in his elevation of prose to a status equal to that of poetry in the hierarchy of writing. In part due to the work of his biographer, James Boswell, Johnson is more often remembered now for his witty remarks than his poetry in prose, but I hope to show today, in brief, the range of Johnson's achievements. Nevertheless, I cannot resist offering one of my favorite Johnson quotations. One of the disadvantages of wine is that it makes a man mistake words for thoughts. Samuel Johnson was born in 1709, the son of Michael Johnson, a bookseller in Lichfield. He contracted tuberculosis from his wet nurse, and as a result was almost blind in one eye, deaf in one ear, and his face was scarred. Perhaps as a result of this early infection, he later contracted what we now call Tourette's syndrome, which caused compulsive nervous tics and muttering. This is not a very auspicious beginning for one who was to become famous for his convivial nature and brilliant conversation. At age 21, much later than was usual at that time, he went to Pembroke College, Oxford. But when his father died 13 months later, lack of money forced him to leave. Without a degree, Johnson was unable to find a reputable job as a schoolmaster, and so he opened his own school, which unfortunately failed. He then relied mostly on private tutoring for his support. In 1737, he went to London with one of his pupils, David Garrick, the great actor, hoping to make a living as a writer. He wrote biographies, political satires, and fictional accounts of parliamentary debates because actual transcriptions were illegal. He titled those debates The Parliament of Lilliput, cashing in on the success of Swift's Gulliver's Travels. His initial success came in 1738 with a poem called London, also an imitation of a satire by Juvenal, but he lived in poverty for many years until he was finally commissioned to create a new dictionary of English in 1746, a dictionary that would emulate the work of the French Academy, who had produced a dictionary of the French language in 1694. In 1747, he addressed his plan of a dictionary of the English language to Lord Chesterfield, hoping for financial support. Lord Chesterfield, however, refused to support Johnson for any of the 8 years he was working on the project. Johnson later remarked, "This man I thought had been a lord among wits, but I find he is only a wit among lords." He also got his revenge in his dictionary, where he defines a patron as one who countenances, supports, or protects, commonly a wretch who supports with insolence and is paid with flattery. Johnson wrote the definitions of over 40,000 words in his dictionary, illustrating them with about 114,000 quotations drawn from every field of learning. Following the tradition of earlier French and Italian dictionaries, Johnson selected a golden age from which he would work, and for him this was the century that ran from approximately the 1580s until the English Restoration of 1660. Johnson employed 6 assistants in producing what he called a dictionary by which the pronunciation of our language may be fixed and its attainment facilitated, by which its purity may be preserved, its use ascertained, and its duration lengthened. Some of the definitions were tongue-in-cheek, like the patron, but overall the intent was overwhelmingly serious and based as much as possible on etymological research, which at the time was highly unusual. Johnson's dictionary appeared in 1755, and it secured his reputation as a scholar and writer. Its commercial success demonstrates the value to the Enlightenment that such an assembly of knowledge held. The dictionary remained the single most important dictionary of the English language until the appearance in the late 19th century of the Oxford English Dictionary. While working on the dictionary, he published The Vanity of Human Wishes in 1749, an imitation, as I said, of Juvenal, his 10th satire. It was extremely successful, and from 1750 to 1752, he also worked on a twice-weekly essay called The Rambler, which covered morality, social manners, and literary criticism. In 1759, Johnson published his philosophical fiction, An Answer to Voltaire's Candide, which he called The History of Rasselas, Prince of Abyssinia. The narrative follows the journey of Rasselas from his utopian existence of Happy Valley through the hopes and disappointments of life in the world. It is considerably less pessimistic than Voltaire's satire and contains none of the scatological humour and violence of Candide. The ministry of George III gave him a pension of £300 a year in 1762, the same year that James Boswell came to London from Scotland and began the friendship that would generate one of the most famous of all biographies, Boswell's Life of Johnson. Johnson and Boswell travelled briefly together in Scotland and published an account of their travels as A Journey to the Western Isles in 1775. Johnson is reportedly supposed to have said of Scotland that it was only a worse England, although the account of his journey contains many kindlier and gentler accounts of the country and its people, despite the many less than flattering observations about Scotland, the Scots, and their food that Johnson is reported to have made. Between 1779 and 1781, Johnson published a series of essays titled Prefaces, Biographical and Critical to the Works of the English Poets, known today as the Lives of the Poets. His long-awaited edition of Shakespeare's works appeared in 8 volumes in 1765. Let us now turn to the specific examples of his poetry and prose, beginning with his imitation of Juvenal's 10th satire, The Vanity of Human Wishes. Johnson defines satire in his dictionary as a poem in which wickedness or folly is censored. He disliked the satire of Swift and said of Gulliver's Travels, "When once you have thought of big men and little men, it is very easy to do all the rest." However, he attempted his own poetic satire in The Vanity of Human Wishes. The 20th century poet and critic T.S. Eliot thought Johnson's poem purer than any satire written by Pope because it was closer in spirit to the Latin. And Eliot claimed that Johnson's London and The Vanity of Human Wishes were amongst the greatest verse satires of the English or any other language. Indeed, it was in large part owing to the critical essays of Eliot that Johnson came back into favour after his disappearance as a literary figure for most of the 19th century. Johnson's poem is an imitation. An imitation was a highly respected genre in the 18th century. It occupies a middle ground between translation and the original composition, and relies, of course, for part of its effects on the familiarity of the audience with the original text, at least in its general sense. It is our loss that any imitation of classical literature today must be accompanied by extensive footnotes, which of course destroys that pleasure of allusion that I referred to in the discussion of Pope's Rape of the Lock. Even Johnson's own audience found it a difficult poem, however, and his friend Garrick remarked that it was like reading Greek. Juvenal's poem satirized ambition and the failure of his own life and drew its examples from history and contemporary Roman life, a model that Johnson follows closely. He begins the poem not in the voice of the detached observer, but from an apparently even more universal and objective perspective. You will recognize the verse form as heroic couplet, the form employed by both Pope and Johnson, and Johnson employs it with the same skill and subtlety as Pope. This is the opening couplet. "Let observation with extensive view survey mankind from China to Peru. Remark each anxious toil, each eager strife, and watch the busy scenes of crowded life." Here, the abstract quality of observation does the observing. It is instructive to compare this attitude to observation with 2 Romantic poets, Blake and Wordsworth. In the opening line of William Blake's poem London, from his Songs of Innocence and of Experience, published in 1794, the observer, the narrator, says, "I wander through each charted street near where the charted Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe." Here, the observer is not only specifically identified as the I, the first person, and also the I, the seeing eye of the poem, but is also implicated in what he sees, noticing as well as marking, that is, placing a mark upon weakness and woe. It is the furthest extreme from Johnson's abstract observation. In Book 1 of Wordsworth's epic autobiographical poem, The Prelude, published in 1805, the narrator says, "The world is all before me," a line that imitates Milton's description of Adam and Eve leaving paradise. The world was all before them, and thus reminds us of the epic nature of Wordsworth's undertaking. But the intimacy and colloquial style of this phrase, "the world is all before me," marks the intensely personal nature of this romantic autobiographical project. Another Romantic poet, Coleridge, was unimpressed by the opening couplet and paraphrased it wickedly as, "Let observation with extensive observation observe mankind extensively." Coleridge here parodies that essential neoclassical belief in addressing the general concerns of humankind rather than the specific particularities of the individual or the local. In another typical neoclassical gesture, Johnson's poem represents his contemporary world of 18th century England as essentially like that of Juvenal's Rome, with only the local variation of names and customs. In this world, as in Juvenal's, how rarely reason guides the stubborn choice, rules the bold hand, or prompts the suppliant voice. How nations sink by darling schemes oppressed, when vengeance listens to the fool's request. The poem surveys the ongoing folly of human ambition and pride, and various historical figures like Cardinal Wolsey, the Duke of Buckingham, and Galileo are depicted, each one doomed to disappointment and suffering. Two contemporary figures are also referred to: the military hero, the Duke of Marlborough, who suffered 2 strokes in 1716 and was paralyzed until his death in 1722, and Jonathan Swift, whose servants used to accept a fee to show the senile writer to the curious. From Marlborough's eyes the streams of dotage flow, and Swift expires a driveller and a show. Johnson asked the question that history repeats in every age. Must helpless man in ignorance sedate roll darkling down the torrent of his fate? The Christian answer, now familiar to us from the novels of Defoe and the poetry of Pope, as well as Voltaire's attack on that answer and the philosophy of optimism in Candide, is that only a belief in divine providence and the essential goodness and wisdom of God's design can be relied upon. As Johnson says at the end of his poem, "Implore his aid, in his decisions rest, secure whate'er he gives the best." We can certainly hear the echoes of Leibniz's philosophy of optimism, all is best, in this conclusion. Let me turn now to his prose. "No man but a blockhead ever wrote except for money," said Johnson, and his entire life was spent writing, much of it for money. His prose was published mostly as periodical essays, and he published in fact 3 series of such essays. The Rambler, published every Tuesday and Saturday from 1750 through 1752, for which he wrote 208 essays, often apparently at the very last minute while the messenger was waiting for him to conclude the essay. The Adventurer, to which he contributed 29 papers from 1752 to 1754, and The Idler, to which he contributed an essay weekly from 1758 to 1760. In the Rambler No. 4, on the new realistic novel, Johnson comments on the contemporary interest in novels. Those works of fiction with which the present generation seem more particularly delighted. These are, he says, such as exhibit life in its true state, diversified only by accidents that daily happen in the world, and influenced by passions and qualities which are readily to be found in conversing with mankind. Earlier writers of the novel, claims Johnson, and he is thinking of the medieval romance form and its later 16th and 17th century imitations, relied on a few conventional narrative devices and plots to bring about their effects. Almost all the fictions of the last age will vanish, he says, if you deprive them of a hermit and a wood, a battle and a shipwreck. These novels were produced, says Johnson, without the toil of study, without the knowledge of nature or acquaintance with life. Such works are easily produced and therefore easily forgotten because they contain no useful ideas or instruction that might educate the reader, the author having no such ideas of his own. The task of the present writers, says Johnson, is quite different. It requires, together with that learning which is to be gained from books, that experience which can never be attained by solitary diligence, but must arise from general converse and accurate observation of the living world. They are engaged in portraits of which everyone knows the original, and can detect any deviation from exactness of resemblance. Other writings are safe, except from the malice of learning, but these are in danger from every common reader. When Johnson speaks of the common reader, he means not the ordinary, the vulgar reader, but the standard reader, the one to whom the best of authors would hope to direct his work. It is the reader who has sufficient knowledge and the experience of life to make correct judgments about the value of what he reads. But the fear of being criticized for making poor copies of human manners in their works is not the worst criticism, Johnson contends, that these writers of the new realistic novel have to fear. What they should really be alert to is the danger that their novels pose, a danger to some of their readers, especially those who are without education. Notice how, in his remarks upon those dangers, he uses the balanced prose style typical of his work. He says, "These books are written chiefly to the young, the ignorant, and the idle, to whom they serve as lectures of conduct and introductions unto life. They are the entertainment of minds unfurnished with ideas and therefore easily susceptible of impressions, not fixed by principles and therefore easily following the current of fancy, not informed by experience and consequently open to every false suggestion and partial account." Clearly, these realistic fictions, and Johnson is thinking of the works of Fielding and Richardson, novels like Pamela and Clarissa, might not be received by ignorant readers as a literature that might, following Horace, both instruct as well as entertain. On the other hand, Johnson remarks, and once again notice how the balanced style is reinforced by the balanced structure of the argument. On the other hand, these familiar histories, he says, may perhaps be made of greater use than the solemnities of professed morality, and convey the knowledge of vice and virtue with more efficacy than axioms and definitions. But, Johnson argues, precisely because they are easy to read, and thus work upon their readers almost involuntarily, only the best examples of behavior should be represented. And here we see that the realistic novel is precisely the opposite of those works that require intellectual labor on the part of the reader, like Johnson's poem On the Vanity of Human Wishes. They are not difficult texts, they are easy, and the connotation of a female sexual laxity is fully present in the description. Remember the connection between the novel and those scandalous French romances that I referred to in the lecture on Defoe. The authors of these fictions can, however, if they select their subject properly, improve their readers. Johnson insists, like Pope, that the author must choose his subjects and represent them so that they reflect and therefore teach the proper moral understanding of the world of nature and life. The chief advantage, he says, which these fictions have over real life is that their authors are at liberty, though not to invent, yet to select objects, and to cull from the mass of mankind those individuals upon which the attention ought most to be employed, as a diamond, though it cannot be made, may be polished by art, and placed in such a situation as to display lustre which before was buried among common stones. For Johnson, all writing, all literature is a form of instruction as well as a source of pleasure. In another essay about fiction, Rambler number 60, Johnson speaks of the value of biography, a genre that he would himself turn to in his later years when he writes his prefaces to the English poets. In this essay on biography, Johnson argues for the moral value of imagining ourselves in someone else's shoes. He says, all joy or sorrow for the happiness or calamities of others is produced by an act of the imagination that realizes the event, however fictitious, or approximates it, however remote, by placing us for a time in the condition of him whose fortune we contemplate, so that we feel while the deception lasts whatever emotions will be excited by the same good or evil happening to ourselves. No species of writing, claims Johnson, seems more worthy of cultivation than biography, since none can be more delightful or more useful, none can more certainly enchain the heart by irresistible interest, or more widely diffuse instruction to every diversity of condition. Biography has a special claim on the writer because it perfectly accommodates the desire to delight and instruct, to move and to teach, to speak of the particular individual and at the same time illustrate the universal human condition. Biography is in a sense then the perfect neoclassical form. Every life, says Johnson, can be made into a useful narrative because there are universal hopes, dangers, and desires in the life of every man, and these should be the subject of literature and art. We are all prompted, he says, by the same motives, all deceived by the same fallacies, all animated by hope, obstructed by danger, entangled by desire, and seduced by pleasure. It is an essential part of how literature teaches that the reader be moved to pleasure by recognition, like the pleasure of recognizing a classical allusion, for example. But in biography, that recognition will be of an experience that can be understood because it is in some way like our own. We respond to and in part help to bring the subject of the biography to life by comparing our own lives with the subject's and by employing our emotions to understand and supplement the subject's emotions. Thus, once again, it is important to select the proper moral subject to invoke the proper moral response from the reader. This insistence upon the reader's response to literature and to the represented life, as opposed to the author's intent, is readily apparent in Johnson's own biographical works, especially the Lives of the Poets. This is a collection of over 50 essays on selected male poets from 1660 to 1770. No living poets were included to avoid charges of partiality, although Johnson had, of course, known some of the poets whose lives he recounted. Let us take a look at one of those biographies, The Life of Pope. Johnson begins his biography with an account of Pope's life, followed by a consideration of the major works with specific analysis of the rhetorical methods and effects of the poetry. This method is in fact the model for all Johnson's literary biographies, and his focus first on the life and then on the work of the author becomes the standard way of conducting literary criticism for the next 200 years. Romanticism's emphasis on the individual and the specificities of the particular life obviously embraced this version of literary criticism. Johnson gives considerable space to describing Pope's painful deformities, to which he ascribes a crucial part in shaping his character. Most of what can be told concerning his petty peculiarities was communicated by a female domestic of the Earl of Oxford, who knew him perhaps after the middle of life. He was then so weak as to stand in perpetual need of female attendance, extremely sensible of cold, so that he wore a kind of fur doublet under a shirt of very coarse warm linen with fine sleeves. When he rose, he was invested in bodice made of stiff canvas, being scarce able to hold himself erect till they were laced, and he then put on a flannel waistcoat. One side was contracted. His legs were so slender that he enlarged their bulk with 3 pair of stockings, which were drawn on and off by the maid, for he was not able to without help. His weakness made it very difficult for him to be clean. Johnson's assessment of Pope the man, and he's quite critical of what he claims to be Pope's exploitation of his illness to justify graceless social behavior. He says that he expected everything should give way to his ease and humor. This account of the man then both conditions his assessment of his work and yet at the same time is separate from his aesthetic judgment. Johnson sees Pope's poetry as the result of a life lived, with all its pettiness, its suffering, its dignity, and its grace. And it is precisely the lived quality of Pope's life and his learning that makes him, in Johnson's estimation, such a fine poet. The method Johnson follows in judging the value of Pope's poetry is the same as his method for examining his life. He is not concerned with slight faults or petty beauties, but rather with the general character and effect of each performance. General character and effect. Here Johnson once again points to the 2 qualities that seem to him of primary importance when judging a work of literature. By general character, Johnson wishes to insist upon both the general quality of the poem that distinguishes it from other poems of the same kind, but also to note how the poem reflects and thus reinforces the general character of its time. The proper subject, properly treated, will thus reflect and reinforce the proper general values of the culture. By effect, Johnson wishes to insist upon the necessity of judging the value of the poem by its effect upon the reader. The poem is no longer, in a sense, the property of the author. It now belongs to the reader. The critic must judge the act of communicating something of value and the means by which that communication succeeds or fails in its task of instructing and delighting the reader. That's what the critic is supposed to judge. It is, therefore, a deeply moral criticism. Such a critical perspective, one that takes into account general character and effect, is precisely what Johnson employs in his commentary on The Rape of the Lock. Johnson acknowledges the universal praise for the poem and inquires into the sources of the pleasure the poem provides. The new race of beings, says Johnson, are perfectly suited to making new things familiar and familiar things new. He says, in this work are exhibited in a very high degree the two most engaging powers of an author. New things are made familiar and familiar things are made new. That familiar things are made new, every paragraph will prove. The subject of the poem is an event below the common incidents of common life. Nothing real is introduced that is not seen so often as to be no longer regarded, and yet the whole detail of a female day is here brought before us, invested with so much art of decoration, that though nothing is disguised, everything is striking, and we feel all the appetite of curiosity for that from which we have 1,000 times turned fastidiously away. On the one hand, then, pleasure comes from the reader's recognition of just representations of general nature, and the recognition of the truth of the imitation. On the other hand, pleasure comes from variety and from the recognition of the truly new, the newness of the truth of nature. Literary activity, writing, reading, judging, is in the end for Johnson a thoroughly social activity. No writer can write and teach without knowing the human and natural world, having a deep moral sense of both and a desire to communicate that sense to the reader. No reader can judge without having some experience of the life that the writer imitates and a moral sensitivity that produces the right response to the imitation. Thus, Johnson reminds us that despite the solitary nature of the physical act of writing and reading, those activities are, in the end, the most deeply social ones we can undertake.